Hello and welcome to the second of three installments in the joint ICTD ATAF webinar series on property taxation in Africa. My name is Moyo Arewa and I'm a program and research officer at ICTD based at the University of Toronto. I will be your host and timekeeper today. The first webinar in the series explored innovative approaches to property valuation with case studies from Freetown, Sierra Leone and Dakar, Senegal. Today, we'll be switching gears to discuss the political and technical dynamics underpinning the use of information technologies for property taxation in Africa. We have a stellar panel of presenters and discussants lined up, but before I introduce them, I'd like to run through some housekeeping rules. The first is that we make provisions for interpretation in 3 languages, English, French, and Portuguese. You'll see a button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can select whichever language you'd like to hear the presentations in. The second is your videos and microphones are turned off right now and muted while the presentations are ongoing to avoid interference and background noise during the presentations. So please keep your videos off and your microphones muted during the presentation. But you can type in your questions into the chat box at the bottom of your screen. And if possible, when you type in your questions during the presentation or at the Q&A section, if you can indicate which presenter or discussant should answer your question, that would be much appreciated. The final housekeeping point is that the webinar is being recorded. If you do not wish to be recorded, you can leave the Zoom meeting and follow the discussion on the YouTube live stream link. And we can share the link again in the chat box. Moving on to the agenda, our first presenters today will be Priya Manwaring and Robert Mugangaizi. Priya is a country economist for the International Growth Center based in Kampala, while Robert is a manager for revenue collection at the Kampala Capital City Authority. They will be giving us an overview of KCCA's IT initiatives for property taxation. They'll be followed by Dauda Kamagate, who is a technical advisor to the Minister of Budget and Portfolio in Cote d'Ivoire. He manages fiscal policies and reforms within the ministry and will introduce us to the Ivorian experience of investing in IT solutions for property taxation. Our final presenter will be Peter Ricci, who is a project manager at the Kaduna Geographic Information Service in Nigeria. Following the 3 presentations, we've also invited 2 discussants to address the content of the presentations. Our first discussant will be Jeru Tusu, who is the head of information technology at the DGI in Benin Republic. And our second discussant is Peter Davis, who's a senior lecturer in property appraisal and management at the Belfast School of Architecture and the Built Environment at Ulster University, and also the Director of Global Research at the Center for Appraisal Research and Technology. That's a mouthful. Of course, none of this would be possible without the efforts of our team at ICTD and ATAF, especially Colette, Ollie, Rhiannon, Sukena, Diana, Frank, and Christine. So thank you very much. To kick us off, I'll hand the mic over to Nara Monkam, the Director of Research at ATAF, and Wilson Pritchard, the CEO of ICTD, to share some opening remarks. Over to you, Dr. Monkam.
Can you hear me? Vous m'entendez?
Yeah.
Okay. So, merci beaucoup, Moyo. Alors, à tous les maires et fonctionnaires des autorités locales ici présents, à tous les décideurs et responsables politiques en charge des réformes et de la fiscalité foncière en Afrique, mesdames et messieurs les représentants d'un ministère, à tous les experts fiscaux des administrations fiscales africaines, du monde universitaire et d'autres domaines, et à tous les invités, je vous souhaite la bienvenue et un bon après-midi à tous. Au nom de l'ATAF, dans le cadre de son programme du réseau africain de recherche en fiscalité ATRN et au nom de l'ICTD, dans le cadre de son programme de l'initiative pour la taxe foncière en Afrique, j'ai l'immense plaisir de vous accueillir à ce 2e webinaire d'une série de 3 événements sur la fiscalité foncière sur le continent africain. Donc, ce webinaire en 3 parties organisé conjointement par la TAF et l'ICTD est un préambule en fait au 6e congrès de la TRN qui se tiendra du 6 au 8 septembre de cette année sous une forme hybride. Donc, d'un côté, physiquement à Nairobi au Kenya, évidemment sous réserve des restrictions liées à la COVID-19, et aussi de manière virtuelle via la visioconférence Zoom. Donc, le congrès de cette année a pour thème optimiser le potentiel des recettes tirées des impôts fonciers grâce à la numérisation. Donc, c'est ça le thème. Et je profite de cette occasion pour vous encourager à soumettre vos documents de recherche sur ce thème avant le 5 juin et aussi évidemment de prévoir de vous joindre à nous au Kenya à ce congrès ou de manière virtuelle, je l'ai dit. Donc, le premier webinaire, comme l'a dit Moyo tout à l'heure, s'est tenu le 24 mars et il portait sur le thème de l'évaluation efficace des biens aux fins fiscales. Et lors de ce webinaire, nous avons eu des études de cas de Sierra Leone, du Sénégal et du Cameroun. Et le webinaire d'aujourd'hui porte sur le thème les technologies de l'information au service de la fiscalité. Quelles sont les stratégies pour une conception et une mise en œuvre efficace? Donc, et aussi, pour vous dire, le 3e et dernier webinaire se tiendra en juin et portera sur le thème « Renforcer la coopération intergouvernementale pour une fiscalité foncière efficace ». Donc, je vous encourage à tous à rester aux aguets pour ne pas manquer ce dernier événement, comme je l'ai dit, avant le congrès de la TRN en septembre. À la fin de la série de ces 3 séries de webinaires, une note d'orientation en fait sera produite par la TAF et l'ICTD pour consolider les leçons apprises et les recommandations des 3 webinaires sur la question de la fiscalité. Et cette note d'orientation sera distribuée à toutes les administrations fiscales et à tous les chercheurs. Donc, le webinaire d'aujourd'hui, comme je l'ai dit, est d'une importance primordiale car les technologies de l'information sont indispensables à une administration fiscale efficace et efficiente des impôts fonciers. Mais malgré l'importance des technologies de l'information, on constate toujours que l'administration des taxes foncières sur le continent reste largement un processus manuel. Donc, au cours de ce webinaire, nous allons examiner les défis de la mise en œuvre de nouveaux systèmes informatiques et nous présenterons aussi les expériences de 4 pays, notamment le Nigeria, l'Ouganda, la Côte d'Ivoire et le Bénin. Et mon collègue Wilson Pritchard fournira un contexte un peu plus détaillé de ce webinaire. Donc, en somme, la meilleure façon d'optimiser le potentiel des taxes foncières est de recourir aux technologies de l'information. Mais il est donc essentiel qu'on continue des discussions approfondies sur le sujet et continuons d'apprendre des pairs par rapport aux réussites et aux échecs qu'on rencontre dans nos divers pays. Donc, sur ce, mesdames et messieurs, je nous souhaite à tous un dialogue fructueux et stimulant au cours de ces 2 prochaines heures. Et je suis convaincue que vous tous vous trouverez ce webinaire stimulant et instructif. Merci beaucoup de votre attention et Moyo, je le ferai. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Nara. Over to you, Will.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you so much, Nara, for the welcome. And let me say what a privilege it is to co-host these events along with ATAF and the African Tax Research Network. My goal is just to offer some brief remarks to introduce the topic of today's session. My goal is to say a few very high-level things about the role of information technology in strengthening property tax systems. My goal is in saying those high-level things to then allow our panelists to say more interesting things about the details of their experiences and the strategies they've adopted to try to make information technology reform a success in strengthening property taxes. As you'll see, I'll speak in English, but my slides are in French to help those listening to the translation to follow what follows. So I'm going to begin by saying a few things about the potential of IT, but in many ways, the potential of information technology to strengthen property taxation is already very obvious. It's well known, and we all know that IT is critical to the challenge of strengthening property tax systems. I think it's critical in 3 particular kinds of ways. The first is that IT systems can simplify and improve property identification, data capture about those properties, and then the process of valuing properties effectively, fairly, and consistently. Secondarily, effective IT systems can work to strengthen data management within tax administrations for administering property tax systems, while also increasing transparency, both internally about the way the administration functions, and also externally towards taxpayers, critically improving the quality of administration. And finally, good IT systems can simplify the process of making payments through banks or through mobile money. It can also facilitate greater engagement with taxpayers to try to build trust among taxpayers and encourage them to more voluntarily comply with tax demands. But in many ways, the benefits of IT for property tax are the easy part of this discussion. The harder part of this discussion, and really the focus of today's sessions, is the problem that despite the potential of IT for property tax reform, that potential has rarely been fully realized, not just across Africa, but also in other parts of the world. And there are a range of reasons for those struggles, but I would highlight 4 things in particular that seem to help to explain why implementation of IT has been so difficult. I think the first is that often the IT systems that have been adopted have been relatively complex, expensive, and poorly suited to the particular systems that exist within the countries in which they're being used. Low-income countries have relatively limited capacities often, but also relatively limited financial resources, and they need IT systems that fit those realities. More broadly, we need IT systems that match the systems that exist, and we need to make sure that the systems are being reformed at the same time that IT systems are being reformed to ensure effectiveness. The second is what I would call a problem of lock-in and a lack of sustainability. Governments may find an IT partner to help them implement an IT system, but having implemented the IT system, they find that that IT provider maybe is not able to provide or not willing to provide effective support to navigate challenges, to update the system over time and ensure sustainability. So it's clear that there's a need for clear strategies for achieving sustainability and to ensure that governments have flexibility in the IT systems that they procure and in managing them over time. The third is a challenge of fragmentation and a general lack of transparency around these IT systems. Across countries, we see very different systems operating in different countries, but also often different systems operating within the same country. And this reflects the fact that I think often governments are going out looking for IT systems with very little information about what IT systems are available on the market, what kinds of features they need to be looking for, which systems have been more or less successful in other countries, right? And without that information, ensuring coherent, high quality systems has been a challenge. And finally, IT reforms often encounter political and administrative resistance when reform begins. So the problem isn't the IT system per se, but it's the adoption of those systems. IT systems bring enormous potential, and part of that potential comes from bringing transparency and accountability into those systems. But in some cases, that transparency and accountability can be a threat to vested interests, or the adoption of new technology may feel like a threat to people in existing administrative positions. There's a need to navigate that resistance. And so when we think about the big picture challenges of transforming IT's potential into real successes on the ground, I would highlight 3 big sets of challenges in particular that I know we'll hear more about as we dig into the case studies in today's webinar. The first is building systems that are fit for purpose. That is, systems that are tailored to the capacities and financial resources of the governments that are procuring them, particularly in lower income countries. Systems procured from Western countries, often costing $1 million or more, may not be the right system for what governments actually need. The second is expanding options and transparency, helping governments to access information about what kinds of systems are available, what capabilities they provide, providing greater coordination and conversation within and across governments to ensure that systems are able to work together effectively, and helping governments to minimize lock-in and ensure effective planning for sustainability of systems over time. One of the government goals of the APTI in future years is going to be help to gather that information and become a resource for governments seeking information about IT options and potential IT reform strategies. Finally, There's a need to think hard about how to navigate the challenge of change management and overcome potential resistance to IT-driven reform. And I think critical to that is mutual learning across governments about their experiences trying to implement IT systems for property taxation and understanding what strategies they've deployed to bring people on board and to navigate resistance effectively. And that's precisely, again, what this seminar and what these broader series of events are about. It's about sharing experiences to develop solutions to transform the potential of IT into transformative change. So thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, and welcome again to this seminar.
Thank you, Will, and thank you to Nara as well for the opening remarks. I'll pass it over to Priya and Robert to start their presentation on the Kampala experience. Priya and Robert, over to you.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Robert Rex Mugangaizi from Kampala Capital City Authority. I'm presenting this paper with Priya Manaring from the International Growth Center. I'm briefly going to talk about how Kampala has leveraged IT in the collection of property taxes. But briefly, we may just want to look at a few facts about property taxes in Kampala. In Kampala, specifically, it is a tax collected on rental or business income of the properties. And not all properties are eligible. About 64%, which are about 224,000 properties, are eligible currently. The other 36% are currently under the exemption regime. And property taxes have over time been improving their contribution to the own source revenues of the city. So currently, they are contributing 38% of own source revenues to Kampala. We have seen that over time, it is indeed like it has theoretically been posed that it is a very, very stable base. So we have seen that it actually has a potential of giving us close to 100 billion, which is about 25 million US dollars, when all the supplementary evaluations, which are expected to become. So it is a very, very good source of local revenue for cities. And so back then, about 10 years ago, when the city kind of was taking new shape under new leadership, there were initial thoughts concerning how to improve local revenues in the city. It is true that property taxes were looked at as one of the potential sources of revenue that should be enhanced. And so a lot of thought was put into what could be done during that time. Next slide, please. And during that time, it was quite difficult to leverage on what was existing to improve the performance of the rates, because the IT systems that were being used were quite limited in ability. The technology was low grade. They lacked ability to integrate with other systems, but also at the same time, what had been automated at the time was more of piecemeal automation. Think about it as the database that was managing the valuation role was different from the database that is managing payments. It was different from the database that is doing the receipting. So it was the kind of technology that was in use at the time. So it was quite difficult for taxpayers to make good their obligations, and also for the city authorities to follow through with the non-compliant ones. So now the initial reforms actually began to target the system, began to target the IT databases that were in use at the time. And so because of the costs involved and the fact that we also had poor taxpayer data, we chose to first start with a payment process. Now, around the same time, we had already made a decision to procure eCity, which was a new system that was quite robust and up to the edge at the time and able to handle many other local revenues. So property tax being unique and having a different workflow from the other revenue sources, we chose to first start with the payments process to integrate eCity with the old databases so that we could easily update taxpayer payments on time and also be able to know who owes us what. The bigger picture was not yet ready because we did not have the resources. Indeed, I want to agree with Dr. Will that these are quite expensive ventures. But with the support of the World Bank, next slide, please. With the support of the World Bank, we were able to get into some new reforms that were able to give us leverage into the future of property taxation. Move to the next, please. And so we were able to get started on the valuation process for the city, and were able to start on the bigger picture of what could actually get the property tax revenues greatly improved. So we scoped out a project with the support of the World Bank, and this project has been so helpful in, number one, documentation of our business processes, because actually we had to do it ourselves, our own way, because when we looked around the market, what was available could not give us what we wanted. We have a different tax regime. For example, our property tax base is based on rental income, and it is quite difficult for us to do even mass valuation models like other cities have done. So we had to come out with our own way of, with our own system that is tailored to our own needs. So we started with documentation of the business processes, literally creating the workflows that would be automated later. So we defined those workflows. And then another team was actually working on valuation of the properties. Now here we employed quite a large number of valuers and data enumerators to collect data from the field, physically collect data from the field, because we were not ready for the mass valuation, much as the project was kind of leveraging on mass valuation models. But at the same time, we kind of started leveraging on experts around the world, including those that were given to us by the APTI and the IGC, to support us in kind of coming up with our own models for Kampala, because the properties are not homogeneous like it is in other cities. So we had to come up with our own models and test them and see if they could actually build us mass valuation models. And I'm happy to say that we are on track. We are on track. We actually have already some models in place that are likely to help us. My colleague will speak more about that. The third thing that we wanted to work on was that the system that we are building should be able to integrate with other national and citywide systems. Now, obviously arising from the inadequacies of the previous system. So this is what you're seeing in the last bullet as the CAMV plus the ECT platform, which allows for tracking of individual property owners. And this system is also able to leverage on corporate GIS. It is also able to link with building permissions so that properties that are coming onto the roll, properties that are just being concluded in the city should actually come onto the roll through that system. I will stop there and hand over to my colleague to continue with the rest of the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Yes, so this process of expanding the tax net and revaluing properties, of course, increased revenues quite substantially. So we saw that, for example, potential revenue across all the divisions more than tripled between 2017 and 2021, and actual collections also increased alongside this. But it also, the process of collecting all of this data on properties in the city provided a rich source of information to actually understand the potential revenues from this source, but also areas for policy reform. So just for example, with the data we now have, it's possible to show that if, for example, exemptions that are currently in place for owner-occupied properties, if those were to be removed, for example, this would actually increase revenues by 26%. I'm not at all, I'm not saying whether I lean towards one side or the other of that kind of proposal, but at least we have the information now to see what the implications would be on revenue collection. Next slide, please. So I just want to highlight three kind of ongoing challenges and also relatedly ongoing reforms that KCCA is working on. The first one is just that one thing that's important to note is that we have seen a number of objections coming in from taxpayers, specifically around the idea that the valuations of their properties are too high. And I think there are a number of reasons that this may be the case, but from my discussions with colleagues at KCCA, certainly one of the key areas that could be considered in more detail in future is how to better sensitize and involve local communities in the collection of data and the valuation of properties to try and mitigate some of these objections up front. The second key ongoing area of reform and challenge, I suppose, is how to keep these property values up to date over time. And of course, this is needed because of the rapid increases in property values that are being seen across the city. So we want to make sure that the recent success of the revaluation process doesn't stop there. And as Robert mentioned, KCCA is looking at now leveraging the data that was collected, not just on property values, but on characteristics of properties to think about models of mass valuation. The IGC has been supporting or working with KCCA on this. I won't go into the details of that, but just one key lesson I think it's important to flag here is that what we've found is that when looking at different models of mass valuation and considering how well they perform in terms of accuracy of predicting property values, what we find is that the completeness of data on properties is far more important than any tweaks we could make to the complexity of models. So it's just an important lesson about digitization only really being as good as the data that you input into that. And then finally, I think one of the key points in terms of moving forward to keep property data and property valuation data up to date over time is that KCCA is now trying to link the valuation database with the Directorate of Physical Planning smart permitting processes, so that, for example, as soon as someone completes the construction of their property and gets a permit to start renting out their property, that property immediately then would be entered into the valuation role. And then the third key ongoing challenge, I suppose, is the need for user-friendly data analytics. Now, currently, anyone in the Revenue Directorate can download and analyze the data, the big data that they now have on property taxation. But it would still be, from my discussions with colleagues at KCCA, it would still be very useful to be able to, within the systems, easily filter and see key statistics, for example, on compliance rates or performance of property collection by division automatically within the system. So trying to think about the user friendliness of these systems is an ongoing area for reform. Next slide, please. So finally, I'm just going to wrap up on to maybe summarize some key reflections from what both Robert and I have been discussing. So the first one is that there are, of course, huge gains to leveraging technology for property tax collection. But importantly, these can be very large and long-term investments. And so they do need the sort of supportive political and institutional environment that we have seen in KCCA, which we can talk about further in the discussions.
One more minute, Priya.
Sure. The second point is that the success of technological reforms critically requires qualified, motivated staff to be able to use these systems, not only use them, but also see where systems need to be improved to continue to be fit for purpose. They need clean data, which I've already discussed, and they also need community engagement and awareness to ensure that to limit resistance to the reforms that are the result of these technological changes. And then very finally, I'll just say, I know that, of course, the topic of discussion today is the role of technological reforms in property tax collection. But I think one thing that it's important to flag from the Kampala experience is that technology is, of course, just one piece of this puzzle. And despite a number of technological improvements that we've seen in Kampala, a combination of weak enforcement and low tax morale amongst taxpayers means that tax compliance with this property tax net is actually still very low. So thinking about ways to complement technological reforms with administrative, legislative, and policy reforms to increase convenience and awareness of taxpayers, to limit large exemptions, to better link the payment of property rates with service provision are all critical parts of this story. Thank you.
Thank you, Priya. For those who joined late, please remember to keep your video and audio off. And for those who would like to ask questions, you can ask your questions in the chat box to your right or on the bottom of your screen, and we will collect them for the Q&A section shortly. Thank you. Over to you, Daouda Kamagate.
Je vous remercie.
Yeah.
Je suis donc Daouda Kamagate de la Côte d'Ivoire. Je vais donc vous exposer sur les technologies de l'information au service de la fiscalité foncière et l'expérience, donc, n'est-ce pas, de la Côte d'Ivoire. Je la mets pour passer la diapo. Non? D'accord. Alors, contrairement donc à l'Ouganda, où nous avons l'impôt foncier qui est certainement un impôt de collectivité territoriale, de différentes communes. Et en Côte d'Ivoire, l'impôt foncier est collecté au niveau de l'État central. C'est un impôt d'État et donc un impôt de collectivité territoriale. Alors, là, c'est un impôt qui rapporte globalement environ 200 millions de dollars, 200 millions d'euros par an à peu près. Sur les bonnes années, bon, nous escomptons atteindre les 400 millions. Et dans ce cadre-là, l'ICTD a fait donc une mission en Côte d'Ivoire pour nous assister, nous aider donc à augmenter notre potentiel. Alors, les technologies donc, de l'information, pourquoi l'appliquer au foncier? On peut dire que la Côte d'Ivoire connaît un boom économique depuis 2011, avec des taux de croissance assez élevés, de l'ordre de 7 à 8% par an de croissance économique. Et mais au niveau du foncier, également, la Côte d'Ivoire connaît un boom immobilier depuis donc, 2011 également. Le taux de croissance annuel de l'immobilier est de 26%. Le chiffre d'affaires en matière d'immobilier a été multiplié par 4. On a une demande d'environ 400 000 et 600 000 logements par an. Et les demandes de ciment ont plus que doublé. Ça veut dire que donc, le boom immobilier que vous constatez dans les villes à Abidjan et les villes secondaires connaît une importance assez importante. En ce qui concerne le résultat du dépôt foncier en lui-même, par contre, vous voyez donc le camembert, le graphique qui le montre là. Alors, les recettes, les parcelles non imposées sont encore très énormes par rapport aux parcelles imposées. Voyez-vous, en bleu, donc, c'est les parcelles, n'est-ce pas, non imposées en Côte d'Ivoire. Et en orange, les parcelles qui sont non imposées. Rassurez-vous, ce n'est pas faute de volonté de les imposer qui fait que nous n'arrivons pas, nous ne le faisons pas, mais c'est lié à certains aléas, notamment l'identification des propriétaires, les questions de cession, notamment la mise à jour et l'actualisation permanente des bases de données qui font que ce système n'est pas très actualisé. Et donc, des difficultés, et donc nous ne tirons pas vraiment l'essentiel de nos ressources de dépôt foncier. Et donc, encore des marges de progression assez importantes qu'il faut donc n'est-ce pas, saisir et n'est-ce pas, capter. Au niveau de l'évolution de l'impôt foncier, vous allez voir donc sur le graphique de droite, l'impôt foncier donc croît de façon un peu pas exponentielle, mais de façon régulière. Et nous avons connu, n'est-ce pas, une forte croissance à partir de 2018, en atteignant, n'est-ce pas, les 200 millions d'euros n'est-ce pas, d'impôts fonciers dans ce sens-là. Mais vous voyez qu'il y a une progression assez plate et nous comptons, n'est-ce pas, poursuivre cette dynamique de croissance de l'impôt foncier, bien sûr avec l'utilisation des TIC. Vous pouvez changer, s'il vous plaît, la diapo. Alors, comment cela donc, va donc, se faire? Comment est-ce que donc, les TIC, les TI, maintenant, comme on le dit, les technologies de l'information, vont donc être utilisées pour pouvoir donc, avoir comme l'objectif, notre objectif, comme je le dis, c'est de multiplier par 2,5 les recettes de l'impôt foncier d'ici 2024, c'est-à-dire de 200 millions à atteindre environ les 500 millions de dollars. Alors, ce n'est pas une gageure, ce n'est pas donc une vision, une vue de l'esprit. L'objectif spécifique, c'est donc d'accroître le nombre de parcelles qui sont donc imposées. Également, d'améliorer l'identification des propriétaires de parcelles en temps réel, d'améliorer également la situation, l'évaluation immobilière, et puis de faciliter le paiement de l'impôt foncier par des moyens modernes. Cela met donc, le résultat attendu, c'est donc de mettre à jour un registre informatique des structures tierces qui collectent, n'est-ce pas, qu'on collecte auprès n'est-ce pas, de ces structures-là, mettre à jour ces bases de données-là. Ensuite, le deuxième, c'est un système d'identification des propriétaires qui est mis en place. Ensuite, un système de blockchain qui permet, n'est-ce pas, l'échange mutualisé instantané et la mise à jour en temps réel des bases de données qui est réalisée. Et puis, enfin, une base de données de référence qui est géoréférencée avec l'identification, la géolocalisation des différents contribuables, des différentes personnes qui sont donc assujetties à l'impôt foncier en Côte d'Ivoire. Voici donc un peu présenter l'objectif principal et l'objectif spécifique de notre étude. Comment cela donc se met en œuvre de façon pratique? La diapo, s'il vous plaît. Alors, de façon pratique, on va voir donc les TI qui sont donc appliqués au système d'identification, comme identifier les propriétaires, les parcelles. Également, les TI appliqués au système de recouvrement de l'impôt, comment payer l'impôt grâce au système des technologies de l'information. Les TI également appliqués au système d'actualisation des bases de données sur les parcelles identifiées. Puis enfin, les TI appliqués au système de gestion du foncier. Voici donc autour desquels vont donc s'articuler notre présentation sur ce sujet. Diapo.
5 minutes, Dauda.
D'accord. Aussi, en ce qui concerne les TI appliqués à l'identification, on a créé ce qu'on appelle une blockchain. Vous voyez là, donc, cette image traduit un peu tout ce que nous avons comme élément. Vous avez comme le MCLU, ça veut dire Ministère de la Construction, du Logement et du Urbanisme, qui apporte ces informations lorsqu'il identifie les parcelles, lorsqu'il crée, lorsqu'il donne, n'est-ce pas, les titres fonciers. Le cadastre, qui également met à jour ces informations. Le BNET, qui est un bureau d'études techniques, qui également, lorsqu'on s'adresse à lui pour tout ce qui est création de nouvelles parcelles, et apporte ces informations. La DGI également nous apporte également des informations en matière d'impôts fonciers, en matière de conservation foncière, en matière de création de titres fonciers. Et puis le laboratoire du bâtiment et des travaux publics, qui lorsque quelqu'un veut, par exemple, disons, mettre du courant, de l'électricité dans sa maison, fait appel à ce laboratoire pour certifier effectivement son installation électrique, etc. Donc, toutes ces informations, toutes ces personnes qui s'adressent à ces différentes administrations-là sont liées plus ou moins au foncier et leurs informations sont directement reversées dans une base de données qui est consultée en temps réel et c'est vu donc en ligne par tout le monde pour que nous puissions donc voir. Et donc, cela permet à la DGI d'actualiser, n'est-ce pas, ces bases de données, si bien que lorsqu'une parcelle est créée, par exemple, au niveau du cadastre, automatiquement, la DGI, là, sur, n'est-ce pas, la blockchain, avec l'identification de la personne, ça nous permet d'avoir donc une base de données actualisée, n'est-ce pas, actualisée chaque fois. On pourra toujours, n'est-ce pas, approfondir cette question-là, compte tenu du temps qui reste. Diapo suivante, s'il vous plaît. Alors, à côté de ça, donc, nous avons les TI appliqués à la gestion. Alors, c'est un système qu'on appelle aujourd'hui le CGC, Système intégré de gestion des impôts et taxes en Côte d'Ivoire, qui va prendre en compte tout ce qui est partiel, l'assiette de l'impôt foncier, l'assiette de domaine, le recouvrement, également les poursuites. C'est un système intégré du début jusqu'à la fin qui permet d'avoir une collecte d'informations sur l'ensemble des contribuables, une vision du contribuable à 360 degrés grâce aux technologies de l'information. Donc, c'est un système intégré qui va donc prendre à la fois les données de la conservation foncière, en même temps de données également du cadastre et d'autres données également qui sont donc matchées pour sortir, n'est-ce pas, pouvoir identifier le contribuable et savoir. Donc, et savoir vraiment ce qu'il y a comme bien. Alors, au niveau donc des parcelles, les références, n'est-ce pas, des parcelles sont entrées. Au niveau de l'assiette, on prend en charge donc tout ce qui est déclaration. Donc, le contribuable en temps réel est suivi et les services de gestion ont donc cette possibilité-là de pouvoir suivre, de pouvoir identifier chaque contribuable et avoir des statistiques de recettes, n'est-ce pas, sur telle personne et sur telle entité, etc. Donc, ça permet, n'est-ce pas, d'avoir une vue d'ensemble de chaque contribuable. Vous pouvez tourner la diapo, s'il vous plaît. Alors, c'est les mêmes éléments. Alors, pour aller à la diapo suivante. Bien, alors, à côté de cela, donc, nous avons un autre élément que le service offert aux usagers en ce qui concerne un logiciel qu'on appelle le e-cadastre Côte d'Ivoire. C'est un logiciel qui permet, comme Google Maps, sur une carte, qui permet la consultation des parcelles détentrices d'un certificat foncier. Donc, sur une carte, vous avez automatiquement une consultation qui permet d'avoir en temps réel les mises à jour des parcelles qui ne sont pas imposées, de celles qui sont imposées, des parcelles où on trouve le plus de recettes fiscales, les zones qui sont... Donc, c'est un logiciel où j'ai fait juste des captures d'écran où on peut, n'est-ce pas, avoir n'est-ce pas, tout un ensemble d'informations, ou aussi le contribuable peut également lui-même, n'est-ce pas, consulter afin de faire des réclamations. Il voit par exemple que s'il clique par exemple sur sa parcelle, il voit par exemple que la parcelle a été donc valorisée avec à tel montant. Il peut donc dire que non, il n'y a pas ça dessus parce que c'est intervenu. Il peut donc, n'est-ce pas, apporter des corrections directement. Et ces corrections sont prises en charge après vérification par les services des impôts. Donc, c'est un système interactif entre l'usager et également l'administration fiscale. Et donc, c'est une application qui est en ligne, qui est utilisée par toute l'administration fiscale et également par les différents contribuables. Le diapo, s'il vous plaît. Alors, donc, comme je le disais tout à l'heure, le contribuable donc, peut voir également sur ce qui est dans ce système. Il voit également la localisation de tous il met son numéro de code contribuable. Et bien sûr, on lui donne un mot de passe et un identifiant pour ne pas que cela tombe entre les mains des personnes malveillantes. Donc, dès lors qu'il rentre dans son système d'identification, son login, le mot de passe, il a donc accès à toutes ces informations-là. La localisation de son bien immobilier, il peut éditer lui-même les documents sur ce bien-là, la situation fiscale, est-ce qu'il doit encore des impôts sur telle ou telle parcelle, est-ce qu'il a encore des éléments, le plan de localisation, les extraits topographiques, les documents délivrés, n'est-ce pas, il peut avoir accès à tout ce qui est document administratif, l'arrêté de concession définitive, les lettres d'attribution, tout ce qui est comme...
Dominion, Dauda.
Je pense que terminé.
Please wrap up. Thank you.
Le diapo suivant. Monsieur Moyo. Diapo suivante, c'est pour terminer. Alors, donc, tout ça, on peut passer encore la diapo. Alors, la dernière application des TI, non, revenez s'il vous plaît, la dernière application des technologies d'information au système des dépôt fonciers, c'est le paiement en ligne. Aujourd'hui, les dépôts fonciers on privilégie, n'est-ce pas, le paiement en ligne par le moyen de mobile, du téléphone. C'est très privilégié dans ce sens que nous puissions, aujourd'hui, près de 50% de dépôts fonciers en Côte d'Ivoire est payé, n'est-ce pas, au moyen des technologies d'information, notamment par le moyen du téléphone. Voici donc globalement présenter un peu l'application, le transfert ou la traduction des TI dans le domaine du dépôt foncier en Côte d'Ivoire. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, Dauda. In the interest of time, I'll pass it over right away to Peter Ritchie from CAD GIS. Peter, you have 12 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks very much, colleagues. I'm very happy that the previous presentations have really set me up quite well here. Next slide, please. First slide. So what are we trying to achieve here? It has to be a progressive approach. So we are targeting government reservation areas, and commercial properties in these particular billing areas. Importantly, these are areas where we have inherited wealth and we have commercial activities. So this is the progressive element. Like for like is very, very important. We want to ensure that our calculations work out in a way where you can see that you're paying the same tax as your similar situated colleagues. The overall tax burden. This is really, really important for us. You know, we're coming from a place where taxes were not collected here for many, many years by successive governments. So the payment of tax, the apportionment of tax and the payment of tax is really a new concept here. And convincing people to actually, you know, buy into the tax system is a challenge. It's a big challenge. But we try to deal with this, in particular with this land use charge, by recognizing that people are paying already ground rent. So we have to be very careful how we deal with the property tax element. Next slide, please. So the context here, CAGIS is responsible for all land matters in Kaduna State. Planning, survey, valuation, and of course, all of the land elements. And we already have an extensive system. We have a land administration system, cadastral administration system, fully linked, network computer seats, and all of the technology you would expect to see in a computer environment. We have, for our raster, we have an orthophoto for the entire state, and importantly at 10 centimeter in urban areas. This really provides us with the means to do survey on the orthophoto, and this is an extremely important element when it comes to property titling. We have a mobile mapper, which is running around as we speak. We've already captured over 4,000 kilometer. And as you'll see later, we're using the mobile mapper in the assessments. We have a drone which captures 5 centimeter imagery to cover those areas that are experiencing big growth between the dates of the orthophotos we have. And for the field work, because we still do field work, we use smartphones and QField to gather that additional data. Next slide, please. So a nice picture of how we actually do the assessment. We'll come to that later. Next slide, please. So again, the context, and this follows really interestingly enough from our colleagues in Kampala. It's not just about the technology and digital systems and databases. You need the institutional arrangements to make this work. So in the case of here in Kaduna, all of the old land ministries, town planning, survey, were all collapsed. The functions, the functionality, and the staff were all collapsed into CAGIS, a new agency, in late 2015. And that's when the CAGIS project really commenced. So we spent just very briefly, a bit of background. So during 2016, we did mass data capture, and then we built offices, because you can't expect to put this type of technology into typical buildings that you would find in this part of the world. So building office infrastructure, which is appropriate for digital equipment, with 24/7 electric. That means lots of generators and so on, because we don't have a good, strong electrical network here. Transport for field work, for moving the people around. And of course, most importantly, the processes, procedures, workflows, and documentation to enable people to be working on the digital systems. Really, really important. Capacity building, close supervision, on-the-job training, all going on all the time to really build the capacity of the staff. Institutional resistance. Well, in this case, it's not institutional resistance because we we stepped down those institutions, but we inherited the staff. So we still have staff who are resistant to using technology and so on. So we still face some issues in that regard. And we try to deal with that, of course, by emphasizing productivity, setting targets, and providing incentives. The two final points here are very important. You need strong project management for this. This is a very, very big agency, over 500 staff. And of course, it needs proper financing so that it can deliver what it needs to deliver. And of course, the most important thing, the chief executive, the governor, needs to remain engaged throughout for all of the above points to actually be delivered. Extremely important. Next slide, please. So the institutional piece in terms of the property tax is captured here quite well. The tax codification and consolidation law, which was passed last year, you'll see that we very importantly inserted into the law a points-based valuation system. That's in 66.1. And then, of course, in section 3 there, the use of the author photo, mobile mapper pictures in the Kaduna geospatial database. It's really important to put all of this stuff into the law, because if you don't put it into the law, you're going to end up with people taking you to court, objecting to what you are doing and how you are doing it. Next slide. So what's our approach here? We want a quick, scalable solution. So we're using all of the data in our systems and the systems themselves to provide a robust, automated process. This is reliant, of course, on now the points-based assessment. This is a desktop job. We don't do the assessments in the field. We gather data in the field. The assessment takes place at the desktop. That previous image you've seen is the way we do that, and I'll explain that a bit later. And of course, using all of the data that we already have together with the technology. So what data do we have in the LAS database? We've got 270,000 land files, policy files, etc. And in the cadastral, we've got 110,000 land parcels. Everything is connected. All of our databases are connected. So whatever we're doing for property taxation is, again, part and parcel of this system. The data collection is continuous, updating is continuous. Sensitization is something that we're doing sensitization meetings almost every week with various communities on various aspects of land administration, emphasizing the benefits. No one is going to pay a tax unless they can see a benefit. So, this is really quite key and critical. Complaints and appeals, very, very important. As was mentioned by our colleagues in Kampala, people do contest their valuation. So we've set up a system in CAGIS where very simple complaint can be lodged, and we will, within 48 hours, make an adjustment or stand by our original assessment, in which case the citizen can go forward to the tax appeal committee, which is run out of the Ministry of Finance. Compliance of the payment of bills is a major, major issue. In our experience here in Kaduna, 30% of bills are paid. So if I had to tell you that we billed 12 billion in the first quarter for ground rent, we know that 3 billion will be paid during the course of the next few months, but 9 billion is going to remain hanging. And this is a continual problem and issue with us here in Kaduna and across many other states in Nigeria. Next slide, please.
Peter, you have 2 more minutes, please. Thank you.
This is how the assessment is done. If you just go back to that picture very quickly. Go back. Yeah. So on the left side, you see the cadastral, you see the building marked in yellow. On the right is the mobile mapper image. And then if you go to the next slide, you'll see the attribute table. So we're looking for all of these attributes before we actually do the assessment. A lot of this data is already coming from the system, but what we don't have, we go out and collect. We already have a step up on this because our billing areas for ground rent were actually based on the services within those areas. So it aligns very, very well with our approach to the LUC. And we use these attributes to plus minus a base value. Next slide, please. So base value, we look at actual property valuations. We've got several hundred of those, and we establish a base value. We use the building volume. From our orthophoto, we extract the building volume from the digital terrain model and the digital elevation model. And then we do the assessment based on the plus minus of those attributes on the other table. And of course, the assessed property value times the rate. Importantly, again, reflecting what's happening in Kampala, you'll see the rate for rental is much higher than owner-occupier. Next slide. Again, just an image so you can see the status where we at. We've got 35,000 buildings in the database. We're testing at the moment the algorithm. It's looking really, really good. And billing, as you see here, is scheduled for June. That should be June 2021, apologies. Thank you. I look forward to questions, please.
Thank you very much, Peter. And thank you very much, Peter, and to Priya and Robert, as well as Dauda Kamagate. Thank you for your presentations. I'll pass it over now to our discussants, starting with Jérôme Toussou from DGI in Benin, to share some comments and reactions and insights from the Benin experience to IT, and if possible, responding as well to some of the points that Priya, Robert, Dauda, and Peter raised just now. Over to you, Jérôme.
OK, merci Moyo. À travers les différentes présentations que je viens de suivre, j'ai retrouvé des points d'intérêt, des centres d'intérêt qui sont communs aux divers pays africains. En ce qui concerne l'expérience de la République du Bénin, ou être plus précis de la Direction générale des impôts, nous avons commencé une première expérience dans l'utilisation des technologies de l'information pour améliorer la gestion de l'impôt foncier au début des années 90. Avec cette réforme intervenue au début des années 90, nous avons ciblé les 3 villes à statut particulier du pays dans lesquelles, à défaut d'avoir un plan cadastral, des plans parcellaires ont été établis. Et ces plans parcellaires ont été réalisés en découpant chaque territoire en quartiers, ensuite chaque quartier en îlots et enfin chaque îlot en parcelles. Les quartiers, les îlots, les parcelles ont été codifiés pour être stockés dans une base de données. On pouvait alors indexer une parcelle, un foncier et avoir les caractéristiques pour l'imposer. Il faut faire remarquer que la valeur locative au mètre carré a été déterminée pour faciliter l'imposition à la taxe foncière. La liquidation de l'impôt foncier a été automatisée. Les quittances également ont été informatisées. Le numéro contribuable est l'identifiant qui permet de rattacher le contribuable à son bien foncier. Cette réforme a permis de faire accroître l'impôt foncier, le rendement de l'impôt foncier, tant au niveau de l'émission qu'au niveau des recettes de 22% entre les années 92 et 1994. Cependant, les paiements de l'impôt foncier, le paiement n'est pas encore dématérialisé. Les contribuables devaient se déplacer vers les centres d'impôt pour le payer. La situation est identique dans certaines villes à statut secondaire du Bénin. Quelles sont les initiatives qui sont en cours actuellement? nous avons une agence qu'on appelle l'Agence nationale pour le développement du foncier qui a cartographié toutes les parcelles du pays. Elle procède actuellement à la fiabilisation des données en prenant comme ville pilote 2 villes. Le cadastre est en train d'être mis en place progressivement. La capitale économique du pays, qui est Cotonou, dispose déjà de son cadastre. Toujours au niveau de l'Agence nationale du domaine et du foncier, il y a un projet qui est dénommé projet de modernisation de l'administration foncière. Ce projet a pour ambition de recenser même les zones rurales. Dans une des présentations précédentes, je crois celle de la Côte d'Ivoire, il a été dit que c'est le foncier bâti qui est vraiment imposé et que le non bâti échappe encore au contrôle. Donc, c'est une problématique que nous avons également chez nous au Bénin. Initiative toujours en cours au niveau de la DG du Bénin. Il y a un comité qui a été mis en place pour travailler à la simplification du mode de calcul de l'impôt foncier. Toujours dans le même ordre, nous sommes actuellement en train de travailler à la mise en place d'un nouveau système de gestion des impôts, y compris les impôts fonciers. Ce système va se baser sur les informations contenues dans la base de données de l'Agence nationale du domaine du foncier, qui permet de localiser le contribuable. Et également, nous allons puiser des données dans les bases des mairies qui contiennent l'information pour le calcul de l'impôt foncier. C'est à travers des interfaces que nous pourrons communiquer avec l'ANDF, avec la mairie de Cotonou et les mairies, afin d'avoir les informations nécessaires pour imposer l'impôt, pour mettre en place l'impôt foncier imposé à sa juste valeur. Les difficultés sont identiques. J'en ai retrouvé quelques-unes dans les précédentes présentations. Il y a la nécessité d'avoir un identifiant fiscal unique pour les contribuables qui sont propriétaires de foncier. C'est un domaine sur lequel nous travaillons et nous espérons qu'avec cela, tous les biens fonciers d'un contribuable peuvent être rattachés à un seul identifiant, qui est l'identifiant fiscal unique. Nous devons également travailler à géolocaliser les biens fonciers des contribuables. Nous devons moderniser la manière dont nous mettons à jour l'information foncière à travers les enquêtes que nous faisons régulièrement. Nous devons également revoir la liquidation, le mode de liquidation de l'impôt foncier, je l'ai dit tantôt, afin que l'impôt soit juste et acceptable pour le contribuable. Les similitudes que j'ai retrouvées dans les présentations et qui concernent également le Bénin, nous travaillons à élargir l'assiette fiscale grâce au partenariat que nous mettons en place avec l'Agence nationale du développement, l'Agence nationale du domaine et du foncier. Et nous travaillons à mettre à la disposition des contribuables les moyens dématérialisés du paiement qui leur permet de faire ce déplacement, le paiement sans avoir à se déplacer. Nous devons également renforcer l'identification des propriétaires de parcelles. Il faut noter que l'Agence nationale du domaine et du foncier a permis de rattacher les personnes physiques qui sont propriétaires de parcelles à leur numéro personnel d'identification, qui est une donnée gérée par l'Agence nationale d'identification des personnes. Donc, nous avons également un partenariat à mettre en place avec cette agence qui identifie les personnes physiques. Il en est de même pour les mesures mises en place pour atténuer ces difficultés, exploiter, comme je l'ai dit tantôt, les différentes bases de données de nos structures partenaires, qui sont l'Agence nationale du domaine et du foncier, les mairies, permettre aux contribuables de faire leur paiement d'impôts fonciers par téléphonie mobile ou virement bancaire, permettre aux contribuables de déclarer eux-mêmes les biens immobiliers en ligne, développer une nouvelle application de gestion des impôts, permettre aux enquêteurs d'utiliser des applications mobiles pour la mise à jour des informations foncières en temps réel. Les leçons que nous avons apprises, il faut forcément qu'on renforce le partenariat entre les différentes structures qui nous permettent d'avoir des informations fiables, complètes pour asseoir l'impôt foncier. Il faut que nous mettions en place une base de données géoréférencée. La digitalisation du paiement de l'impôt est une bataille que nous devons remporter en utilisant la téléphonie mobile ou le virement bancaire. Globalement, pour faire un point, je dirais que l'impôt foncier a encore beaucoup de potentialités qui ne sont pas encore exploitées. Les technologies de l'information peuvent nous aider à améliorer la liquidation, le recouvrement, le rendement de cet impôt. Les technologies de l'information peuvent nous y aider à travers une meilleure identification de la matière imposable du foncier, à travers les moyens modernes de paiement que sont la téléphonie mobile et le virement bancaire. Voilà en quelques mots l'expérience que je souhaiterais partager avec vous. Merci.
1 minute, Jerry. Thank you, Jerry. Before I move over to our next discussant, Peter Davis, if you'd like to ask any questions, remember you can type in your questions into the text box on the bottom of your screen or the side of your Zoom screen. Over to you, Peter, to share your reflections.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's so great to be invited to come along and do this today, to get these great insights from these case studies and to see the progress that's being made in these different jurisdictions. I'm particularly interested in the Kampala story, which has been such a success story over the last few years. I was first involved in Kampala back in 2005 in a project writing the rating regulations for the new rating act there, and it's come a long way. It's great to see. So the topic in terms of technology for property tax, there's such a wide, next slide please, there's such a wide variety of technologies that have emerged and come down the track for property taxation or potentially to be deployed. Some of them we've been dealing with and taking advantage of for quite some time. However, they're not necessarily universally available, understood and used across the property taxation sphere. Even the your databases, spreadsheets, etc., which can I think can still be have greater penetration and greater use as staff become more IT literate and as the hardware, the laptops, tablets, etc., become more widely available. So there's such a fantastic amount of advantage that can be taken with all these basic technologies. But then some of the more emerging technologies which have become available to tax jurisdictions around the world. A key one, CAMA, computer assisted mass appraisal, very powerful and probably to an extent essential for doing mass valuation, particularly of residential properties anywhere really. Certainly couldn't be countenanced in the West and fully economically developed countries without using mass appraisal techniques, and certainly to an extent essential and necessary in the African context. But of course, if you're going to actually use the full capability as described on the box, as it were, of a CAMA system, well, you need good data. And we were hearing from the Kampala scenario, I very much echo that. It's more about the information that you've not collected or that you don't have available than it is about the minutiae of the algorithms being used to do the appraisal. And I think the experience from Kampala is going to be of great interest to an awful lot of jurisdictions around the continent and around the world. GIS, we've heard some great stories there about the use of geographical information systems and geographic information science. Of course, it facilitates the identification of properties, and it also has the promise of allowing spatial-based regression models, which can be very, very powerful, particularly in helping jurisdictions defend their valuations in their capacity to actually maximize the use of, nearby similar property transactional data. And of course, the great thing there is it's getting easier and cheaper to use GIS. And it's very exciting what's going on in Kaduna and Cote d'Ivoire, etc. Very exciting. One challenge, though, for example, Tanzania has had a kind of a very good story in terms of their introduction of GIS, but I think it has regressed quite a lot as well. You need the political will and the support, of course, to go with it. We've heard about satellite imagery in some of the in a couple of the presentations. Again, for a moment there, I thought I was muted. And it's fantastic at that large scale, capturing imagery at a jurisdictional level. Could you just go back one slide, please? And it's getting cheaper. That's the other thing. It's a great strength of some of these technologies that with greater use, they become cheaper and more accessible. For example, it's being used in a mass survey activity in the Punjab, and it will be used in the near future in Sindh, both in India. And certainly Karachi is expecting to bring in an additional 1 million parcels using that when they do their next survey. Drones we've heard about, again, complementary to the satellite imagery for getting that close-up detail, and very, very effective for local area data capture. And examples of where this is being done well include Zanzibar, where there was a project where the drones were piloted by university students in a good example of information and data gathering. And there's other ones such as LiDAR, which is capable of significant data capture, things like height, building materials that have been used, and again, getting cheaper and easier. But I also think it's important to focus on some of the more taxation, less property, more taxation focus, like mobile money. And the key here, and we've heard there from a couple of the presentations, it's important to make it easy for taxpayers to give you their money. It can't be difficult. If it's difficult for them to actually pay, then there's going to be problems and you're never going to maximize your revenue. So great examples from Kenya and Uganda in that regard. And also there, we've just heard from potential in Kaduna. And I think it's important to herald this because this really is an African innovation that the rest of the world can learn from. And I think that's important going forward, to acknowledge and realize that innovation can come from within the continent and within the jurisdictions, and not always be a kind of a hand-me-down type scenario.
3 minutes, Peter.
Yeah, so yeah, I think it's important to look at other things as well, like property banding, simplified, robust valuation approaches, and also indexation. There's always going to be political pushback on revaluations, and a good set of indices can help you get on. Your next slide, please. There's too much on this for me to go in great detail, but the general point is that from picking through the bones of all this, is that I think there is need to appreciate that there is a continuum here. There's no such thing as a right solution. The solution's got to be right for the jurisdictional scenario that you're in. That might be a simple system. It might be a more sophisticated system. Even some Western countries, the United Kingdom, in their residential taxation is using a very, very simple, potentially out of date system, but it's raising the revenue and it's doing the business. The point of the technology is a force multiplier to allow you to overcome some of the basic scenario difficulties that you've got in any jurisdiction, but they are the tools for raising revenue. Next slide, please. And that's just some thoughts really to leave. Do you actually need a legal cadastre for this? It's useful and it's great to be integrated, but I don't think that municipal finance can wait for legal cadasters. The UK doesn't have all their property taxation running off a legal cadaster. It's a fiscal cadaster. And when you're starting up and trying to get going and make progress, is it really even a fiscal cadaster as the starting point? Maybe it's a common address file is what you really need. That's what's more important. And you can ideally geocode that, and lots of emerging data and tools can be linked to it. Another thing is how important are capable, well-educated and well-supported staff rather than the latest sophisticated tools, because there's lots of open source options coming down the road these days. And I feel from those stories that we've heard, it's really capable, motivated staff that we need who are capable of taking on these opportunities. How sophisticated do your evaluations need to be? We're talking about a sharing mechanism here, and revenue is the name of the game. So I think we shouldn't get caught up in sophisticated valuations. We should be looking at sharing mechanism basis and moving forward to get the revenue in. And I suppose just to leave it with, what does the future hold? Obviously, if I knew that, I would be a wealthy man at this point, and certainly wealthier in the future. But I think we can acknowledge that from a technology perspective, it's a very fast moving world. It's important to be agile, tech savvy and knowledge orientated. And perhaps one way of thinking about it is that perhaps what the jurisdictions need to own is the revenue, and not necessarily worry too much about the system. For example, in the United Kingdom, vendors come and go. The data, the base data and the revenue potential is the core that needs to be focused on. Systems can be developed, new systems can come along. You know, we can apply competitive market forces to this. One of the questions that came up there in the questions was, how much does all this technology cost?
Please wrap up, Peter.
Thank you. So I think that's the focus that we need to go focus on, the revenue and being capable of taking opportunities as the technology evolves. Thank you.
Thank you to Peter and to Jeru, and of course to our presenters as well. We're now move on to the Q&A section. Please remember you can write your questions in the text box to the right. But we've already received a few good questions and some provocative ones as well. I would direct the first question to Dauda Kamagate. You presented a system that is rather ambitious and novel, including using a somewhat untested technology in blockchain. Could you tell us a bit more about the process of implementing the system, some of the challenges that you perceive with trying out some of these novel and ambitious systems and IT technology, information technologies? Maybe honing in on specifics of how you ensure that the data you're collecting on properties and property owners are going to be accurate and useful for staff in the administration of property tax. So this is a question specifically for Dauda.
Bien, merci Moyo pour cet intérêt que vous portez dans la présentation. Alors, la technologie blockchain, c'est une nouvelle technologie que nous allons mettre en place pour l'impôt foncier, compte tenu de l'information détenue de façon parcellaire par chaque entité. Alors, c'est un système qui sera donc mis en place avec un système de salles de monitoring sur chaque entité. Chez nous, en Côte d'Ivoire, il y a les administrations, les services qui détiennent chacune une information sur l'un sur l'autre. Vous prenez par exemple, en ce qui concerne l'électricité, la compagnie nationale d'électricité détient forcément des informations qui peuvent concerner le foncier. Là, lorsque quelqu'un veut faire son abonnement à l'électricité, il se rend à la compagnie ivoirienne d'électricité, qu'on appelle la CIE chez nous, et fait donc son abonnement. si la maison ou la parcelle où il veut mettre l'électricité n'est pas déclarée aux impôts, ce sera donc dès lors que la compagnie d'électricité va donc enregistrer sa demande d'abonnement, automatiquement, tous les autres acteurs de la chaîne vont donc disposer de cette information-là. La DGI saura quoi faire. La même chose demande pour la compagnie de l'eau. Quand vous demandez de l'eau, c'est que vous avez forcément une maison ou une parcelle quelque part, forcément. Donc, c'est des informations pour qu'on mette à jour en temps réel nos différents éléments. Mais surtout, ce qui est important, c'est qu'au niveau de la compagnie d'électricité, il est plus facile, par exemple, pour elle, aujourd'hui, tout le monde paye en matière d'électricité, tout le monde paye sa facture d'électricité. Le taux de recouvrement de la compagnie d'électricité, la dernière fois, était entre 90 et 95%. Ça fait rêver. C'est-à-dire que 90 à 95% des personnes qui sont donc assujetties à l'électricité payent l'électricité en Côte d'Ivoire. Au niveau de l'impôt foncier, nous avons vu tout à l'heure, on était à peine à 30%. Donc, à 30-35%. Ça veut donc dire que le système de géolocalisation, de localisation de ces compagnies d'électricité pourra donc être utilisé dans la blockchain pour localiser telle ou telle, n'est-ce pas, personne. Pouvoir utiliser, n'est-ce pas, son système de géolocalisation. Et aussi, en même temps, aussi, ils ont besoin de nos informations pour savoir que dans tel quartier, par exemple, dans tel cadastrage, dans telle parcelle est rattachée à tel numéro de cadastre. Ça permet également, eux, de se passer de ce qu'on appelle chez eux, qu'on appelle ici les AZ, c'est-à-dire les agents de zone. La compagnie de l'électricité, souvent pour retrouver ces différents abonnés, utilise une masse importante de ressources humaines qu'on appelle les agents de zone, qui vont sur le terrain localiser, distribuer, n'est-ce pas, les factures. Et cette compagnie, elle est dépendante de ce personnel-là. Donc nous, avec notre système de géolocalisation et de pouvoir, n'est-ce pas, directement avoir accès à tel ou tel terrain, ils peuvent se passer de ce groupe de personnes, de cette catégorie de personnes-là qui constituent pour elles une menace, aujourd'hui, vous le dire. Parce que lorsqu'ils sont en grève, il n'y a plus d'électricité qui est payée. Voilà, c'est aussi autant d'éléments. Et surtout aussi, avec la compagnie d'électricité, c'est celle que j'utilise le plus, parce qu'il y a des éléments, je vais vite en finir, faire des simulations, faire des monographies. Par exemple, on dira que pour tel type de maison, avec tel type de pièce, dans tel quartier, voici l'électricité. Voici donc le montant de l'électricité qu'on paye. Donc, établir un algorithme entre le montant de l'électricité et le montant de l'impôt foncier. Si bien que quand quelqu'un est dans la même zone, que son électricité, le montant de sa facture d'électricité à un tel niveau et que cela ne correspond pas à l'impôt foncier, il y a un problème. Donc, tout ce qui est comme données aberrantes, données qui sortent un peu du cadre moyen, ces personnes-là feront donc directement l'objet de contrôles plus approfondis. Donc, voici un peu pour justement présenter un peu sur la question de la blockchain, un peu quelques éléments juste sur la partie de l'électricité, il y a peu d'éléments encore. Voilà. Et le contribuable lui-même, directement, il doit consulter les informations qu'on lui donne. Voici donc pour un peu plus court, un peu les aspects que nous pourrons donc donner en matière de blockchain. Voici un peu quelques éléments que nous pourrons donner sur ce sens. Merci, M. Moyo.
Thank you. Thank you, Dauda. There are some follow-up questions, but just to distribute the responsibility a little bit, I'll move on to a question from Roy Kelly for Priya and Robert, and also for Peter. You both talk about the cost, complexity, and of the IT systems in your respective cities. And in the KCC example, you even give a picture of the revenue gains since the period of the IT reforms. Could you contextualize this for us from a cost effectiveness and ROI perspective, a return on investment perspective? Is there a sense of when the cost of implementing and operating the IT systems might yield or might be paid off by the revenue generated, the increase in revenue, presumably due to the implementation of the IT systems? So this is a question about cost effectiveness specifically, about returns on investments, and about whether this is even the right framework to think about or assess the impact of technology investments for property taxation in Kaduna and in Kampala. So maybe Priya and Robert, you can go first, and then Peter, you can take a stab at the question. And please keep it to 2 minutes each.
Sure. Robert, do you wanna answer this, or do you want me to take a stab at it?
Okay, I think I can. I just want to share with members that in the first year of implementation of the reforms, property tax collections were about 32 billion. And the valuation project, along with the purchase of the system, cost us about 22 billion. So already within the very first year, we have recovered the cost of the valuation process and the purchase or the procurement of the system. And we had a net surplus of 10 billion. Yes, from a city perspective, that is not what we expected. We had expected the rates collections maybe to rise up to 50 billion, but we still have these other challenges, which I think will be another thing to talk about in these forums, because yes, technology is one piece of the puzzle, and yes, it helps, but then there are other impediments that we need to talk about. Thank you.
Priya, would you like to add your thoughts on that?
No, I think Robert's captured it well. So that's pretty much what I was going to say. From looking at the figures I have, the costs of collection have been recouped within, a year or maybe 2 years at most.
Right.
But I think it's a year. And the other thing just to add to that is that I think the operating costs are more than paid for as well. We have those figures. And right. Yeah, the increase in revenues more than make up for the operating costs as well. Yeah.
Right. Over to you, Peter. So it's a question about cost effectiveness, about returns on investments for IT investments in the Kaduna context. Where's your stand? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, again, I'm going to repeat that it's not just about the systems. You have to also account funds for actually, establishing the project. As I said, from our experience, it's not just IT, it's the building, it's from everything from ground zero. Moving from a paper-based system, hello, I'm getting crosstalk here. Moving from a paper-based system to full digitization is quite a substantial investment. We recovered all costs at the beginning of the 3rd year. We're now in the 5th year. We're still incurring costs. We're continually, doing what we do, but those costs are fully absorbed by the incoming. How much has the state actually gained in terms of revenue generated since we started billing through the system at the beginning of 2017, and we have generated 37 billion. That's around $90 million. The cost of the system, the cost of the system till date is somewhere around 20 million. So it's expensive. It's very expensive. And it also, you have to take into account the environment that you're operating in. Anyone doing business here in Nigeria will tell you this is a very, very expensive environment. But I'm happy to say we recouped fully at the beginning of the 3rd year.
Peter, I'm just going to ask you a follow-up question. In your presentation and in your response just now, you emphasize the broader challenges of reform, the broader institutional, political, technical challenges of reform. And it gives us the impression that perhaps you think that these broader challenges supersede the technological challenges specifically. Is that the case in your opinion, concretely? That you can't really decouple the technological challenges from the broader reform challenges?
I firmly believe so. I'm aware of many projects that have started up here in Nigeria offering IT solutions for land administration, property tax. and they have failed. They've not failed because of the technology necessarily. They have failed because they haven't grasped the importance of the institutional reform. They have not grasped the importance of the capacity building element, the being on station. I mean, we didn't come in here, set up a system and disappear. We're still here. This is our 6th year in Kaduna, and we continue building capacity. This is vitally important.
Thank you, Peter. In the interest of time, I have a question for Jeru. You mentioned the desire to identify property owners as part of the reform process. How exactly would this work? Would you require in Benin, would it be required, would identification of property owners be required for them to be taxed? Or would you be able to tax certain property owners regardless of whether or not they've actually been registered formally as property taxpayers? So this is a question for Jeru. I don't know if perhaps I should repeat the question.
Donc, vous avez demandé comment on s'organise pour pouvoir identifier les propriétaires de parcelles. C'est bien ça. Propriétaires de parcelles, de foncier. OK. D'abord, il faut faire remarquer que tous les propriétaires de foncier pour lesquels il y a un titre foncier sont déjà numérisés dans la base cadastrale qui est en train d'être mise en place. Donc, tous ceux qui sont des propriétaires fonciers et qui ont un titre foncier pour le bien foncier, on arrive déjà à les identifier. Parallèlement à ça, au niveau des mairies où l'information foncière est également disponible, on a des présumés propriétaires qui sont au niveau de des bases de données de ces mairies, mais qu'il faudra vraiment établir l'authenticité, ou bien il faudra qu'on s'assure que ceux-là sont de vrais propriétaires, les mairies n'étant pas en mesure de pouvoir dire que telle personne est vraiment le propriétaire. Il faut forcément qu'on se base sur les informations reçues au niveau de l'Agence nationale du domaine et du foncier qui peut vraiment attester que telle personne est propriétaire de telle parcelle. Au niveau des enquêtes fiscales que nous faisons régulièrement, nous collectons des données et ces données que nous collectons, c'est des données qui sont attachées à des présumés propriétaires également et il faudra travailler à identifier, à établir la véracité de cette information comme quoi les personnes recensées sur le terrain sont effectivement les propriétaires. Donc, c'est autant d'éléments qui nous permettent d'établir régulièrement, progressivement du moins, ça, le lien entre les propriétaires et les biens fonciers. Il faut noter qu'au niveau de l'ANDF, il y a un travail appréciable qui se fait, qui permet de collecter les informations qui sont détenues au niveau de l'Agence nationale pour l'identification des personnes, qui permet d'associer à une personne physique un numéro qu'on appelle numéro personnel d'identification et de pouvoir associer ce numéro à chaque bien foncier qui se trouve au niveau de la base de l'Agence nationale du domaine et du foncier. Donc, voilà tant d'éléments sur lesquels nous travaillons pour pouvoir être sûr, se rassurer que les propriétaires fonciers, du moins, ce sont effectivement ceux que nous adressons. Merci.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jeru, for a very rigorous answer. I now have a general question that I think any 6 of you could answer about data sharing. We've heard across many African countries, in fact, globally, data sharing between government agencies, even with the private sector, can be very difficult. Systems are manual, and even if they're not manual, they're interoperable. They're not interoperable. What, in your view, are the factors that, both the political and technological factors that either enable or or block effective coordination between your respective cities and other government agencies or private actors that you may be involved with. For example, the Ministry of Lands or the Identity Management Agency, or even the Revenue Authority directly. So I would just, perhaps you could start with Priya and Robert if this is a question you can address. If not, we can pass the mic to someone else. So this is a question specifically about data sharing and coordination operationally between government agencies.
Sure. Well, maybe I can say a few words, and then Robert, I'm sure you'll have much more to say on this than I do. But I suppose specifically, one of the areas that KCCA is working with the Uganda Revenue Authority on now is precisely this idea of sharing data to be able to link the system that KCCA has to collect local government revenues and the system that URA has for national government taxation. And I suppose technologically speaking, one of the key barriers is just that from the onset, those two systems were not integrated at the starting point. So there's a lot of work that now needs to be done to try and link, for example, tax identification numbers at the local government level with the ones at the national government level, so that we know, so that there is some sort of way in which to look at both those data sets simultaneously. But maybe Robert, you can speak to some of the challenges or perhaps reasons that this is only happening now, let's say.
Yes, thank you, Priya. The journey to data sharing started about 6 years ago, sometime in 2014. URA being the big brother, URA is the Uganda Revenue Authority, wanted data from the local governments so as to expand their register. And so a project which is called the Taxpayer Registration Expansion Project was set up, which comprises Uganda Revenue Authority, KCCA, Kampala Capital City Authority, and other local governments across the country, plus the Uganda Registration Services Bureau. Now, that project is responsible for making sure that there is data sharing among all the parties concerned. KCCA needs some data from URA. URA needs data from KCCA. URA needs also data from the other local governments, but also KCCA needs data from the neighboring local governments and the Uganda Registration Services Bureau. But also in part, we wanted to formalize the informal sector, who are largely operating in an informal manner. So as a result of that project, we've gone digital now to digitalize the interfaces between the participating institutions. So as we speak right now, there is a big project going on, a big ICT project that is kind of trying to build interfaces between the Uganda Revenue Authority collection systems and then the local governments plus KCCA and the Uganda Registration Services Bureau. Until the project is done, we are sharing the data in a manual way. We write to URA, they send it to us in an Excel spreadsheet, or we send it to them in an Excel spreadsheet. But yes, there is data sharing. Thank you.
Maybe just one further thing I can say, which just building on what Robert has said, is that I think critical to that process has been the fact that there is interest on all sides to make this data sharing work. And maybe that's perhaps part of the issue in other contexts where data sharing doesn't work as well, is where maybe it's more of a one-sided need for that data sharing process. But I'd be interested to hear other people's opinions on that.
May I suggest that Peter Ritchie, because Kaduna is a particularly complex state in Nigeria, even just the mandate of tax administration alone is complex. How have you navigated the complexities of coordination within the Kaduna state government machine, and also with non-governmental actors, if necessary?
Well, I think firstly, and most importantly, the institutional arrangement for CATCHAS, Kaduna State Geographic Information Service. Remember, we collapsed the old Ministry of Town and Country Planning. We collapsed the Survey Ministry. Those all came into CATCHAS. So there's no institutional issues regarding land management. In terms of development control, we're actually automating the development control agency, Kazupta, and we have a link between those two databases. Most importantly, we have very good connections with CAD-IRS, Kaduna Internal Revenue Service. So we push all of our bills to them electronically through an API, and likewise, they return all the payment information, so we're able to do some reconciliation on our accounts. So government to government in Kaduna State, the cooperation is 100%, and it's driven by the chief executive. This has been one of the hallmarks of his administration, is government actually working for the people. When it comes to private sector, I can give you a good example. The local electricity distribution company, these were parceled out across Nigeria. They have got a fantastic database. They probably have a better database than we have. And I say probably because I don't know, because they won't share. Sharing data from private institutions is still a big issue. So yeah, progress in terms of the government side, but cooperation with the private sector, not very good.
Thank you. I'll just, unless the other panelists in discussing subject, I'll cap the question on data sharing to ask a more targeted question for Dauda. As a follow-up to your last answer, we would like to know specifically what the difference is. My timer. What the difference is between the blockchain system that is being piloted or being implemented right now in Côte d'Ivoire and the eFoncier platform that already exists. So the differences between those two systems. Dauda, you have 1 minute.
Merci. Merci Moyo. Je vais être très bref. Alors, le système de plateforme qui existe actuellement, c'est des systèmes de plateforme que je peux dire passifs. Et voilà, l'information hier, on va chercher l'information. La blockchain est un système dynamique. Alors, on apporte, il est tout le temps actualisé, et donc il est mouvant. Donc, les données sont donc mises en temps réel, par jour, et vérifiables et contrôlables par toutes les personnes qui sont prises dans la blockchain. Alors, contrairement au système de plateforme, n'est-ce pas, passive, où vous avez des données, vous les consultez, etc. Voilà, c'est ce dynamisme. Et surtout aussi, c'est la variété de l'information. Voilà, vous avez donc, c'est pas forcément l'information directement nature fiscale. Quand j'ai parlé tout à l'heure de la compagnie, n'est-ce pas, d'électricité, le ministère de la construction qui délivre le permis de construire. Quand on délivre un permis de construire à un individu ou à une personne, c'est que forcément, c'est pour construire une parcelle. Et si cette personne n'a pas déclaré, aussitôt nous savons, nous l'avons. Donc, ce sont des guichets uniques dans lesquels chacun éprouve une information dynamique dans le sens dans son domaine, contrairement à la plateforme, n'est-ce pas, foncière où il y a des éléments de ça. Et il faut dire aussi qu'on va relier cette blockchain-là au système de bourse immobilière, parce qu'il n'y a pas que des spéculations immobilières. Donc, il va y avoir une sorte de barème immobilier. Voilà, dans telle zone, les terrains sont vendus à tel prix le mètre carré. Et donc, cela pourra donc être utilisé également pour mettre à jour les valeurs vénales, les valeurs locatives. Voilà, c'est juste pour être bref, vraiment, la différence qui est sur ce domaine. Merci.
Thank you, Dauda. You were right on time. Okay, one more question then, and then perhaps we should wrap up. And this is directed to Peter, but anyone else can answer if you can speak in 30 minutes or less. It's a question about deployment, software deployment. We've come across the dilemma of deciding whether to procure open source software or closed source software. And experts disagree on which is more appropriate. And perhaps it depends on a specific context, data needs, user needs, staff capacity, and so on. But Peter, specifically, do you have any expert opinion to share on how property tax software should be deployed and procured?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I am the go-to expert on software procurement for governments, but I just think the days of being a passive recipient of a standard off-the-shelf package, I think I've gone. I think if the initial focus needs to be on upskilling the staff to be able to work. I mean, I know that the guys that I work in the university who are doing an awful lot of GIS and modeling, etc., they're capable of moving across and deploying different softwares. So open source software to do one activity, some licensed software that we have for other things, and it's the interoperability. But the focus is on, I think, if the focus is on making the staff resource skilled and competent, and focusing on your own core data, having the geocoded base data, etc. And then if you want to experiment, for example, with some geographically weighted regression modeling, maybe you just want to use a bit of open source software and get to that, get over that initial hurdle. Then if it's going to be a big thing that's going to be a core system, maybe you go and procure it with the associated support and such like for a period of time.
All right, thank you very much. In the interest of time, I just wrap up a very interesting Q&A section. Thanks to all of you who asked questions. Thanks, of course, also to the discussants and the panelists for providing your answers. I'll pass it now over back to Dr. Nara Monkam to share with us some outcome statements, webinar outcome statements. Over to you, Nara.
Thank you very much, Mayo. How long do I have?
Less than 10 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll try to be as fast as possible. Okay. I hope I do have the ability to share my screen. Because now I don't see the icon. Oli, can you please advise?
Should work now.
If I don't, then I'm just gonna read through it. Please confirm.
Nara, why don't you go on, and
okay.
And once it's available, you can put it up. But in the interest of time, let's just move on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then please notify me when it comes, because it'd be nice for the participant to actually get the opportunity to see, but we can also share. So thank you very much to all. If you'll allow me, I will basically share the key messages that we have that basically were highlighted today. So in terms of a background, we know that the potential of ICT in property taxation is very much underutilized in Africa. And some challenges include complex and not well suited ICT systems with limited financial resources, the lack of sustainability with ineffective support.
Nara, you can share your slides now, yeah.
Okay, give me a second. I still don't see the icon on my side. I will continue. So, and also the poor interfacing with other systems, like we said, in other government agencies, but also the lack of political will and support that may actually threaten the statu quo of these systems. There's also the revenue leakages that has been exacerbated by the lack of updated fiscal cadastre in our countries. And as mentioned, for example, in the case of Côte d'Ivoire, the fact that the fact that the real estate boom is not actually proportional to the number of property and land that are actually taxed. So in that context, for example, we had the case of Kampala, where the reforms undertaken by the Kampala city authorities, we've seen that they are quite helpful in terms of increasing revenue. For example, we had an increase of 100% in 3 years. And then reforms are also targeting the system as well as the database. In terms of challenges that they have experienced so far, we've seen the high level of objections mentioned in the area of valuation, but also the fact that keeping property valuation data updated actually is quite of a challenge. And of course, we mentioned the challenge of having actually friendly data analytics that are helpful for decision making. So in terms of key messages in that case, we can say that political will is definitely key. Clean and updated data is vital. The awareness and community involvement is also important. But all that must be underpinned by administrative and legislative reforms. In the case of Côte d'Ivoire, they demonstrated that they have started implementing reforms related to ICT in the case of property identifications, exchange of data with other institutions, transparency, but also integrated management systems, but as well as the use of mobile phones to help with the collection of property taxes. And we have seen the growth in revenue since 2018 in Côte d'Ivoire. And while the reform is still being implemented, the results are already promising. Mr. Daouda mentioned the use of blockchain as well as GIS systems linked actually with public utilities like water and electricity to actually increase the identification, but also the revenue collection ratios. It's interesting the fact that he mentioned that through that interfacing, they're trying to reach the rates, actually the rates of collection by public utilities, which are close to 100%. It was mentioned 90 to 95%, whereas the rate of collection on the property tax area is between 30 and 35%. So that interfacing the blockchain and GIS, as well as the linkages with public utilities, are quite important in that context. In the Kaduna case, the use of geographic information system relying on technology like drones, mobile mappers, smartphones, as well as, again, linking database has been also very important or crucial to allow for massive property identification and valuation. They also mentioned that IT is not the only thing that is important. We also need to focus on the institutional arrangement, infrastructure like offices, as mentioned, capacity building, but also workflows and procedures. In terms of key messages in the Kaduna case, we can note, for example, the importance of having a connected database, the importance of sharing of data across government institutions, as well as the continuity of data collection, but sensitization as well as systems of complaint and appeals is also important in that case. Overall key messages, we can say that ICT, of course, is not a panacea. It has to be accompanied with infrastructural, legislative, institutional, as well as policy reforms. And the collaboration among institutions is key to ensure data sharing and that interoperability of systems or interfacing of systems. Also, it's important that we are not too caught up in too much sophistication. We need to remember that the ultimate goal is to widen the property identification, widen our fiscal cadastre, but also our revenue collection. And of course, data quality is key. Under collected information basically must be is also important there. So the revenue, the return to investment must also be considered. we must consider the cost-benefit analysis when we are adopting these systems. Other key messages, we can say that technology is a support tool that can only be used optimally in a favorable environment.
2 minutes, Nara.
Yes, in a favorable environment that is supported by with an overall organizational, institutional, and political setup. And then, of course, continuity and capacity building to users of the technology is also very important for sustainability. So basically, that's what we can basically draw from this engagement for the 2 hours. And I want to thank all the participants for this. Thank you very much, Mayo.
Thank you, Nara. I'll pass it over to ICTD CEO, Professor Will Pritchard, to share some concluding remarks. Over to you, Will.
Great. I won't add much beyond the wonderful summary that Nara has already shared, but just really to say again, thank you to all our panelists, thank you to all the participants, and of course we will be holding the next in this series of webinars sometime in late June, looking at the important question of the relationship between central and local governments and authorities in the execution of effective property tax reform, something that we've heard through both of the 2 webinars to date. And so I hope that you'll all join us again for that webinar, and then of course to echo Nara's invitation to everyone to register, to submit papers and register for the HERN Congress in September as well, so that we can continue to build this discussion. I think there's a huge range of questions that we've begun to discuss today that we could have discussed for much longer. And so hopefully this is the beginning of a much longer discussion about these questions. So thank you all very much again.
Thanks, Will. Well, the webinar is officially concluded. Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We want to also use this opportunity to thank all our interpreters. Thanks to you, we had an event in 3 languages, in French, English, and Portuguese. So thank